Gary, when I was thinking about introducing him tonight, several things came to mind. But it occurred to me that, back, I think it was the month of January that we look at vocational service. There's one month when we look at it. And it's like, how do we apply our vocations, to Rotary? And I think if anybody exemplifies that, it's Gary. As a physician, many physicians give of themselves, but Gary gives of himself to the world and creates really unique ways. I mean, whether it's through global grants, when they do the healthy clinics down in Central America, he's been to down to South America. Before everybody came on, I just found out he came back from Martinique with a group that he's associated with. Obviously he works as a doctor, but I think, Gary, your inspiration really comes to us through that service, and that service includes CART. Gary's been a really key member of the CART board and the CART leadership for quite a while. And one of the significant things is not just the research and everything that he chairs when they review grant submissions, but also, CART is dependent upon giving. And I think, Gary, you spearheaded, the online donations, and now we have the opportunity to give on a monthly basis. So you've had your hand and your heart and your talents in CART in many, many ways. And as I've told a lot of folks, I think one of your most profound gifts to us is the fact that you can explain things in terms that we understand. Yeah. And so we are delighted to hear updates and to get some of those layman's terms in our minds, because then that helps us when we talk to other people about CART. So thank you so very much for being here tonight. And as Candace mentioned, and Ken, all of us have known somebody, either a family member or somebody who is close, and they have been affected. And so we just turned the program over to you, and we're just very excited for the updates that you're going to provide. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I've got a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to bring up, but I do want to tell you a lot about the CART program itself. And then if we have time at the end, I really want to spend some time talking about some of the latest treatments for Alzheimer's disease. It's not all directly related to CART research, but I think it's interesting for people to see because there are some major breakthroughs in treatment, and CART did contribute to that. So let me bring up the presentation, and y'all see that okay?
Yes.
Great. So you can see my role with CART is I've served since 2018 as the Vice President of Research Grants. I have to tell you, Jim Puryear, that's a Rotarian up in Greenville area now, he's actually in a retirement community, and he served in this position for 10 years and did so much work in getting the system down. And I, of course, changed things and updated a bit, but Jim is really the one that got it going, and I'm indebted to him, and we talk on a regular basis about CART and how to deal with issues from time to time. And as I told some of you earlier, I'm now the president nominee of the Fort Myers Sunrise Rotary Club. They got me as secretary this year, so I continued that role, and I'm going to get to be a club president for the 4th time. So hopefully that'll be my last time doing that. But that's just a little background, and let's see if we can get it to go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease and what it is. And basically it's brain failure. It's a progressive brain disorder that destroys brain cells, and we see it in the loss of memory. You can't learn, you can't make judgments, you can't communicate, and eventually you can't even carry out basic daily activities. It's not the same as normal aging. Lots of us find that we can't remember names, or we have trouble finding a word every now and then, and that's normal. But you often can think of it later, and that's the difference. It doesn't impair you. You're able to remember things later on. Alzheimer's, though, it's progressive. It's a fatal disease. At the moment, we do not have a cure, although great strides have been made towards that. So just remember, starts with gradual memory loss, culminates in total cognition failure and the ability to care for. So the brain actually has about 100 billion nerve cells. They're called neurons, and these electrical signals travel through those neurons, and that's how our memories, our thoughts, our feelings are formed. And Alzheimer's basically destroys those neurons. So it has a big impact. These are some pictures of what the brain looks like. You can see there on the upper left, that's a normal brain. On the right, you can see how the brain is atrophied or shrunken a great deal. That's a classic hallmark. And then on the bottom, you can see where it says NFT, that's a neurofibrillary tangle. We know that comes from tau now. That's one of the proteins that's deposited. And then there's also the plaques, the amyloid plaques. So you can see that in a microscopic image below. Of course, nowadays we don't do brain biopsies on live patients. These were all in patients that had died and been autopsied. So that's not a good option for diagnosing it. And there's a close-up view. You see the plaque and the neurofibrillary tangle. Pretty obvious when you look at a microscopic section of the brain. So how did CART start? This is really an amazing story. And I know some of you have met Roger Ackerman. He passed away a couple of years ago, but Roger was a member of the Sumter, South Carolina Rotary Club, and he had a family member that developed Alzheimer's, and he saw the devastating effects of the disease. And he said, let's see what we can do. So he did an 8-month testing program. He asked club members to put coins in little blue buckets that we still have today. And he said, I'm going to raise money to support Alzheimer's district or Alzheimer's research. July of 96, District 7770 in South Carolina adopted CART as a district project. And then they kept collecting coins in those buckets for 4 years. And finally, by 1999, they had enough to give a $100,000 grant to Dr. Alan Levy. And you'll hear Dr. Levy's name later. He's now the chairman of our review committee that looks at all these grant applications and decides which ones we should fund. And then the deal is that each district that joins the CART program has one representative on the board and one vote. All the districts put their money into one account, and then decisions are made from that as to who we're going to fund for research. Great news now is in zones 33 and 34, we have 25 districts that are fully supporting CART now. We'd love to see that go across the country and the world. And there's even been talk of after Rotary International finishes polio, maybe Alzheimer's would be the next project. I don't know, but that's where we are right now. And this is our review committee. I kind of oversee that. I am not a researcher. I don't understand everything I read in these research proposals, but we've got Dr. Levy, Dr. Carl Harrop, University of Pittsburgh, and then most recently, Dr. Julie Schneider has joined us from Rush University. You know, people have the strangest times to call you, don't they? So this is the review team that when we get our letters of intent in each year, they go through those. They select their top 7 to 15 projects as finalists. We get additional information, and then we make a decision on which grants we're going to fund. So I won't show you all the grants, but I want to show you how it started and where we've ended. And I highlighted the names. You see Alan Levy got the first grant, Carl Harrop got the second one, and then John Trojanowski, who was a member of our review committee for years and passed away a couple of years ago, he got an early CART grant in 2003. But these guys they have been a godsend for CART. We would never know exactly who to fund without their help. And so that's how we started. And this is what's happened in the last 2 years. 2022, we funded 4 different grants. You can see the grant awards have gone up quite a bit. From the first 100,000, we're now doing $250,000 and $300,000 grants. We've actually named these. We've got the Roger Ackerman Award as our top award. So you see 2022, Dr. Kim and Quinny from Massachusetts General and Harvard got a $300,000 grant. That was the Roger Ackerman. And then we have another award called the John Trojanowski Award. And so typically our second one, Dr. Tessier got that last year. This year we did 3 grants. We were a little bit down in funding this year, and we only had $850,000 to give out. We had been on a 3-year roll, giving out $1 million a year. And this past year, it cut back a little bit. So we did $850,000. But all in all, if you count back from the first grant to Dr. Levy, we've done 67 grants, given out $11.85 million. Pretty amazing from a project that started with putting coins into a bucket. And this is one of the happy parts of my job when we have the annual meeting. I get to present each of the researchers. And you see us giving out a check there to Dr. Athenakaran at University of South Florida. And so great experience of meeting these guys and interacting with them, working with them for the 2 years that they have the grant funds. So I wanted to show you some of the research institutions that have had multiple grants. That tells you a little bit about the quality of their research, but Washington University turns out has had 7 different researchers receive grants there. Harvard Medical School, Mass General Hospital in Boston, gotten 4 awards. Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville has been very productive. They've had 4. Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York with 2. University of Kentucky had 3 awards, Penn State 2, Cleveland Clinic 2, and of course many other grants institutions that just got 1 grant. So here's kind of the bottom line. 100% of every dollar donated to CART goes to Alzheimer's research. That was one of Roger Ackerman's big things. He didn't want any monies donated going to operating costs. So a lot of people through the years have donated to buy the blue buckets and take care of travel and different expenses. But everything you give in those blue buckets or through the portal goes to the actual research. We've had 43 research institutions receive these. There's now over 800 Rotary Clubs in 25 districts supporting it. And for those of you not aware, we actually started a separate 501c3 organization called TRACK. It's CART spelled backwards. And that's a fund that people can donate to actually support operations. We've had some major fundraisers that have put money in to help in covering marketing, travel, blue buckets, all the things that you have to do to keep this going. So if you ever get the idea that you want to give to the operations, the TRACK fund is available for that. I want to just share a little personally with you. I, of course, am involved in Alzheimer's on a day-to-day basis now. I work as the medical director of a major retirement community in Fort Myers, Shell Point Retirement Community. And we've got 2 major memory care units and lots of patients, even in independent living, that are dealing with neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's. But what really touched me was when I saw my own parents get Alzheimer's. My mom and dad was a Presbyterian pastor. Mom was a university English teacher, and very, very bright people that were hard workers and just gave their life to helping a lot of people. And when I got back from Afghanistan in 2009, we took mom and dad on a cruise. And that's their picture there on the left. And they were in pretty good shape at that time. 5 years later, huge difference. Mom actually passed away in April of 2015, and Dad died 4 years later, both considered death from Alzheimer's and its complications. So I've seen this from being a child of parents with Alzheimer's and seeing what it does to caretakers. It's just a devastating disease, not only for the patients themselves, but the people that care for them. Sometimes I wonder if it's worse for the caretakers as you get into the later stage of the disease. But that's what impacted me and kind of drove me to say I want to be active in CART. And so I did want to mention to you that we have this new online CART portal. It's real easy to remember. It's just mycartfund.org. And it's actually done. Terry Weaver helped set this up with DACDB. And you use the same login that you use to get into DACDB because they're integrated. And so it's very easy to go into, and you can give directly to CART through that. You can set up recurring donations. We've even got a thing now called the Roger Ackerman Society. So if you sign up for recurring donations, you can be a part of the Roger Ackerman Society. So please take advantage of this. It cost us about $20,000 to set it up initially. Again, somebody did a major fundraiser to pay for that. But this is so much easier. We used to have to send money to the CART district chair, and then they had to package it, send it to the CART bank account. This takes it directly out of your bank account, or you can also do it by credit card. They ask you to pay the processing fee if you use a credit card, but it's much, much easier to give. Clubs, districts, anybody can go into that CART portal and bring in funds. And also just be aware of the CART website, just cartfund.org. And we've got a brand new website. Tiffany Irvin is the new executive director. Many of you remember Bill Shillito, perhaps, and Bill is still very involved. He's a regional manager now, but Tiffany is the executive director, and she's a marketing person and done a great job getting the website reorganized. So a lot of great information there that you can look up anytime. There's also a Facebook site. You can click on the little Facebook icon on the website, and that'll get you the latest news on CART. And they're having monthly programs with a researcher presenting their research. There's updates on Facebook, so take advantage of those sites. But do you have any questions at this point about the CART fund itself before I get into talking about the disease and treatments? Anybody have any questions at this point?
Julia has a question in the chat.
Okay, let me look at chat over here. Okay, so the donation site track, who donates for which favor do we have to let our club know when we donate? No, the beauty of the portal is because it's integrated with DACDB, it knows exactly which club you're in, and your club automatically gets credit. That's the beauty of it. It knows all of that. So you don't have to write anything. It just knows which club, which district you're in. And I know, Lance, you were looking out for the CART fund at one time. It's very easy to go in and see exactly what the club is given, what individuals are given, what districts have given. It's all right there real time now.
Gary, does that portal pick up people who were donating before it actually opened?
Diana, we tried to get as much data as we could ahead of time, and it's not as granular early on. We were trying to get the district information in there, but it goes back. We've had it up for a couple of years now, so you can't get the detail prior to when the portal opened, other than just general district donations.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let me jump back into the presentation if I can.
Actually, Gary, if you don't mind, I just very quickly, I want to give a shout out to Tiffany, couple months ago when Alberto was making an emphasis on us making sure that we met our CART goals, I got onto the CART website process and got tangled up somehow, and anyway got stuck somewhere. And I got out of it, and about 15 minutes later, Tiffany calls me and says, "Can I help you?"
Wow.
She is right on top of it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
you got a good person there helping you out.
yeah. There's actually another lady now that oversees the portal site. And when people are having trouble, it was so interesting during the annual meeting. I was trying to put a donation in, and I was having a little bit of trouble, and the lady knew it right away, and she got it all fixed. In fact, Lenna, I didn't know it, but all of my recurring donations have gone in the E-Club's name because that's what they had. And I didn't know that until I was trying to set it up and couldn't get it to work right. And so
Thank you, Gary. We appreciate that.
I gave a year or so of CART funds through you. So let's see if I can get back in here. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease, and what this slide is meant to show is that if you can reduce when people actually start developing symptoms, you can reduce the prevalence of the disease. So early recognition, early treatment makes a huge difference, because Alzheimer's, the older you get, the more likely you are to have it. So if you can slow it down early on, it's going to have a big impact on that person's life. And I wanted to show you this slide. We know now, thanks to a lot of work of CART researchers, that these proteins called amyloid, beta amyloid, and now one called tau build up in the brain. And they're now doing PET scans. And so you can see on the left here is somebody that's normal, and you see how it's mostly blue and green and yellow. And then on the right, when they have this amyloid beta, it turns a red color, that red-orange color. And so it's very, very prominent on these PET scans. And I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute of the new drugs and how they take that amyloid plaque out of the brain. And so what you can do, a lot of the research studies will start with a PET scan. They'll do all the different studies we normally do to rule out other causes of dementia. By the way, dementia just means short-term memory loss. It's kind of a larger term. Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, but there's other types like vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontal lobe dementia. And so Alzheimer's is the most common, but dementia just means you're losing your memory. Okay. So there's other causes, people that have severe depression, if they have sleep apnea, if they had a severe B12 deficiency, they've had a history of syphilis in the past, those could all cause loss of memory. And so we always want to rule out those things before we call it Alzheimer's disease. And these are our current treatment options. You may have heard of donepezil or Aricept, Exelon, Razidine, Cognex, Namenda. These are all medicines that actually block the uptake of acetylcholine. That's how those neurons communicate. There's a chemical called acetylcholine. And so what these drugs do is they block the uptake of that. So there's just basically more signal at the neurons. And it doesn't cure it, but it slows down the process significantly. And so if you can get people on these drugs early on, you can significantly slow the course of it. Now, the exciting news is that right now there's 141 drugs being tested in clinical trials. That's exciting. For years and years, the National Institute of Health really didn't do a lot of research in Alzheimer's. They spent a lot more on infectious diseases, things like HIV. They didn't get involved. Now the NIH is seeing what a problem this is, and there's a lot more funding there. Now, of these 141 drugs, 78% are designed to try to slow how quickly the disease progresses. So the slide I just showed you about Aricept and Namenda and so forth, that's the kind of drug we're talking about there. But there are 3 new, very promising drugs. Y'all have heard of monoclonal antibodies. We used it to treat COVID patients, and they use it to treat things like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And there's hundreds of these monoclonal antibodies, but there's 3 that they found that are very, very promising. And so I want to talk about each of those. The first one is a drug called donanemab. It's made by Eli Lilly, and it's an immunotherapy drug. It basically attaches to amyloid, removes it from the brain. And it's a drug that you have to come in on a monthly basis and get a IV drip, and you got to keep it going. Amazing. They had a phase 3 clinical trial called Trailblazer, Alzheimer's 2, had 1,182 patients in it. They had amyloids in their brains when they did PET scans. They had memory and thinking problem. And look what happened. The drug slowed down how quickly memory and thinking skills get worse by 36% in people living with early Alzheimer's disease. They showed a 40% slowing in the decline of everyday activities, and it removed amyloid from the brain of more than 70% of the participants in 18 months of the trial. That's pretty significant for a drug. That's much, much better than we've seen with what's available on the market right now. The second drug is lecanemab, or they're going to market as Leqembi. And this one really is exciting. It's another immunotherapy for early Alzheimer's. It's also given by IV infusion. It's actually been approved by the FDA starting this past January. And so there was a trial called Clarity AD that they released in November of 2022. And again, it removed amyloid and tau proteins from the brains of people with early Alzheimer's. Their decline, their thinking memory was slowed by 27%, slowed down the decline in quality of life up to 56%. So, and you may say, well, that's not very much. It'd be nice if it improved at 100%. But again, the trials were early. And I think as the drug continues to be used, you'll see even more improvement. And then the other one that's really promising is remternetug. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but what it looks like, but it's another immunotherapy produced by Eli Lilly. But this one, as opposed to having to come in and get an infusion every month, you just inject it under the skin. It's like insulin or antibiotics. It's just an injection. And they're very, very early in their testing of this. But after 6 months of treatment, they said 75% of 41 people had amyloid cleared from the brain. And remember, donanemab took 18 months to have 72% cleared of amyloid. This is much faster, seems to be a much more effective drug. So these are just fantastic. And I've talked to several Alzheimer's researchers that say these are game changers. This really is going to change it. And I don't know, it's interesting. Dr. Levy got the very first CART grant. And guess what his project was? It was proving that PET scans could pick up amyloid and actually diagnose it. So literally from that work, that's what's driving these new drugs. So it's fascinating. And I wanted to show you these pictures. These are actually PET scans done on another drug. This one's called aducanumab. And if you look before treatment at the top, you see all of the red that shows the amyloid. And look at the bottom, and they show you placebo and then low dose, medium dose, and high dose. It looks like the high dose, the amyloid is almost gone. This was after 1 year of treatment. Now, I will tell you that this drug has not done so well. It costs $65,000 a year for it. They found that, they found that some people actually developed bleeding within the brain. and major side effects from it. And so there was a lot of controversy about whether this drug should be released, and the FDA approved it, but they had several of the FDA panel resign over that decision. And so this drug's kind of fallen out of favor because of its cost and the side effects. But the newer drugs I just told you about are much, much cheaper. The second one that I mentioned is about $25,000 a year. That's still a lot, but a whole lot cheaper than $65,000. And they haven't seen the side effects. Most have said that if you keep the dose reasonable, you get less of the side effects. So that makes good sense. But these are dramatic PET scans showing actual clearance of amyloid when you use these drugs. And then finally, I want to just emphasize with you that there are a number of modifiable risk factors. If you don't have Alzheimer's or memory loss, there's lots of things you can do to actually prevent this from happening in you. And it's interesting, the Lancet looked at dementia prevention, and they said if we could intervene and address modifiable risk factors, we could prevent or delay up to 40% of dementia cases. Again, the healthier you can stay, the longer, the more likely you're not going to develop Alzheimer's. Have y'all heard of the blue zones around the world? It's an interesting concept. Loma Linda in California, they found that life expectancy is more than 10 years longer than that for average American. There's a place down in Costa Rica where men over 60 are 7 times more likely to reach the age of 100. Sardinia, Italy, 10 times more centenarians than the US per capita. Caria, Greece, 1 in 3 Icarians live to be at least 90 years old. And Okinawa, Japan, life expectancy is 85.3 years. I'll tell you, at Shell Point, we often brag that our patients live 10 years longer than their counterparts. And we've got 18 people over 100 now. I saw one of the guys this week, and he's 103. He'll be 104 next month. And he was telling me that he found a website to predict longevity. And he put in all of his medicines and problems and his age, and the computer said he was going to live to be 107. And so my goal now is to keep him alive that long and try to beat what the computer says. But truly, you can do some things that are going to prevent formation of it. And so what they found here is that the life lessons, they move naturally, they have a right outlook, they have they eat wisely. And so let me show you some of the things that are prominent in these blue zones. People there predominantly eat a whole food-based diet that incorporates a lot of beans. They engage in constant moderate activities of walking, gardening, biking. They have very strong familial and social bonds. There was actually a TED talk a few years ago that looked at factors that affect longevity. And they said the number one factor was relationships, the strong family and social bonds. And then individuals have a sense of purpose and faith in their lives. They downshift to reduce stress, and they don't smoke. Doesn't that sound like healthy type things to do? And just smoking, again, secondhand smoking, there's not much good about smoking. When I take tests and there's a question about risk factors, I always pick smoking because it doesn't do good for anything. You have lower cognition functioning, high blood pressure, all kinds of problems as a result of smoking. And they've also found that if you do brain stimulation, and they said that the ones that really are supported by research, Sudoku, crossword puzzles, chess, puzzles, and jumbles are supposedly the most effective. I like to play solitaire. I'm not sure it qualifies, but anyway, that's what the research says. And they also said if you use your less dominant hand, it forces concentration Do you have a question? Yeah, they said some other things you could do is drive and walk different routes and just be aware of what's going on in the research in that area. And then you wouldn't think dental hygiene would be a big deal for memory, but it turns out that if you look at Americans 65 and older, they have a lot of moderate or severe periodontal disease, according to the U.S. Centers of Disease Control. And they found that bacteria actually go into the brain and they can trigger Alzheimer's pathology. We know now from a lot of our CART researchers that this is an inflammatory process. I think that's why these monoclonal antibodies are working, but there's inflammation going on in addition to the amyloid and the tau particles. So infections can trigger that. And they actually showed there's a bacteria, Pseudomonas gingivalis, in the brains of 90% of Alzheimer's patients. And so if you could prevent that with good dental hygiene, it may help you in preventing Alzheimer's. So bottom line is, if you suspect memory problems, get a cognitive baseline, see a physician that knows about this, order labs, check for sleep apnea, rule out all the reversible causes of memory loss. And of course, treat your modifiable risk factors, and diet, exercise, moderate alcohol. Those are all good things to do. Keep your mood and your relationships in check, protect your head. I wear a bike helmet every time I'm on a bicycle or doing anything that could injure my head. So it's good to do that. Of course, minimize high-risk behaviors, listen to music, remain cognitively active, and just love and live life. And that'll help protect you. Remember, dementia-like symptoms can be experienced without the progression, brain changes, and sometimes you can even reverse it. So remember, there's a number of things. So sleep apnea, medicine side effects, Lyme disease, thyroid problems, B12 and folate deficiency, excessive alcohol that could also cause dementia. And so, trying to figure that out before it gets too far along is a good thing to do. So remember, now the research is changing. We're going from just treatment of symptoms to actually disease modification. I think all these new monoclonal antibodies, extremely exciting. I hope we're going to see more of these drugs develop and we can actually cure it and reverse the effects of Alzheimer's disease. And you think about the cost of this, it is a very, very expensive disease. They talk about $7 trillion a year. Look at Medicare, 3.3 trillion, Medicaid, 2.3 trillion, others, 1.4 trillion. This is an expensive diagnosis for our society. And then if you look at projected savings for individuals, look at what it saves. I think this is probably low. They're saying you save about $64,000 a person. It makes that $65,000 drug cost look a little bit better, but it's still quite expensive for families. And so that's pretty much it. I do want to remind you that on the first Tuesday of every May, we have our annual CART meeting. This past year, it was in Greenville, South Carolina. And we also ran Zoom. And so we encourage you to get on. If you can't come to the actual meeting, you can join via Zoom and actually see the researchers present their research. One of my jobs is to talk to them and convince them that they have to talk like it's their mother or grandmother they're describing the research to. And so I was pleased this year. I think we had some of the most understandable presentations yet, and they're beginning to catch on that you have to talk to the audience that's helping pay for these grants. And so I hope you can join us again next May for the annual meeting. And there you go. So remember cartfund.org, and then you can go facebook.com/cartfund. And then you remember the portal is mycartfund.org. So please give through that. And with that, I'm going to stop the screen share and see if you've got any other questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Has there been any research on the use of statins to help prevent the onslaught of the disease?
Yeah, it's interesting. Not that I'm aware of in terms of, but that's when you look at those healthy living. The people that I know that live the longest tend to have healthy cholesterol and lipid values. So I don't know of research directly that says that statins are going to prevent Alzheimer's, but we know it's going to contribute to less cardiovascular disease. And that was the whole point of the blue zones. If you live healthy and keep the rest of your body, presumably that does help. So I think indirectly it does help, Greg.
Gary, we've got two questions in the chat section. I'm going to read both of them. One from Judy, she writes, I heard people with Alzheimer's disease are more aggressive in behavior. Is that true? And then the second question is about, can you talk a little bit about accurate and timely diagnosis? And then we hear that Alzheimer's is the most prevalent of dementia. Is that just because it's diagnosed more, or is it the most prevalent?
It is the most prevalent, but keep in mind that Alzheimer's means that you've ruled out every other type of dementia. And so, for example, somebody that had multiple strokes, had high blood pressure, we would call that vascular dementia, even though the patients look just like the ones that have Alzheimer's. So, Alzheimer's, that ends up being the diagnosis because they don't have another identifiable cause of dementia. And so that's why it's most common.
Okay.
And then in terms of accurate and timely diagnosis, that's been a real key, is to figure out how can you diagnose this early, because we know very clearly that you start getting amyloid and tau plaque much sooner. It can be 20 years before you see symptoms. And so how do you figure that out? And so we encourage people, if you see issues with memory loss, it's better to go through the testing. We typically get blood work. We do an MRI of the brain to look for classic changes of Alzheimer's or other types of dementia. And we do neuropsych testing, and it's pretty good at figuring out if you've got dementia, and they'll do serial exam. There's some exciting things. CART actually funded a study looking at retinal scans, and turned out the machinery was just too expensive to do it on a mass basis. But there's ways you can actually see these amyloid particles. If they could get a blood test, that would be great. There's also some genetic things. If you've got the ApoE genotype, that puts you at a much higher risk. And so if you've got a family history, if you see evidence of memory loss, get tested early, because the quicker you can get started on drugs and slow down the progression, better you're going to do overall. And your question about the aggression, it's not everybody develops that. I'll give you a good example. My mom and dad, very different presentations of Alzheimer's. Mom had just severe paranoia. So, for example, they lived at a house in Bristol, and there was a guy next door that had a lot of lights outside. And Mom was convinced he had a helicopter circling in the sky, looking at him, and people stealing from the house. And it was just scary. She would call the police. They got to know her by name. She called so many times, and she just worried herself sick. And so some are much more aggressive. We'll call it dementia with behavioral disturbance. You got to treat that. On the other hand, my dad, he was very gentle through the whole thing. After Mom died, and Dad would say, "Oh, I think your mom's doing okay tonight." And I'd say, "Well, Dad, no, she passed away a couple of years ago." And he would say, "Oh, yeah, you're right. I remember now." And he was just very gentle about it. And you could convince him of things. And he didn't have the paranoia. And so everybody's a little different. But tell you, it is hard on caretakers. Have any of you cared for patients or family members with Alzheimer's, yeah. You remember they ask you the same question a dozen times and you want to say, I just answered that. And of course, it doesn't matter. They don't remember they asked.
No. Well, Gary, this has been, as we expected, just a outstanding presentation. Coming from you, it makes it even better. And hearing the promise of drugs on the forefront, while they're expensive now, hopefully, in years to come, there'll be ways that will be things that will drive those costs down. And you've certainly encouraged us to think about early diagnosis, because now those abilities to be diagnosed are there where they weren't, years ago. And then certainly all of us can do our part to live the best life that we can. And you've encouraged us with that. So thank you so very much.